Okay, so I will start now. So that's already the last day. I can see that all of you are still there. So yeah. So that will be, I think, the last lecture on magnetism. So I will discuss today antiferromatic spintronics. So I'll be using some concepts that were introduced last week by Michel on general spintronics, and also a little bit what I've been introducing on spin wave dynamics in ferromagnets, and trying to show you some of the differences when we work with antiferromagnet compared with ferromagnets. So my vision is really the vision of an experimentalist also, as you have seen yesterday from the talk of Paolo. If you want to have, let's say, more theoretical description based on the magnetic point group, it can become generally quite complex really quickly. So I will try just mainly to show you what type of effect you can observe in antiferromagnetic materials and in altermagnetic materials. But yeah, that will be just an introduction to this concept. So when we talk about antiferromagnets, it's always important to remember what are really the key differences compared to ferromagnetic materials. First, the fact that there is no stray field, then that it's quite difficult to control the direction of the antiferromagnetic order with external magnetic field, and the antiferromagnetic resonances, they lie in the Tara's range. I will discuss these three properties in detail and explain you why we have these three different properties in antiferromagnets. So this makes them fundamentally really different from ferromagnets. So that's why they were quite interesting from a theoretical point of view. But that's also the reason for which, for many years, we didn't think of using or trying to use antiferromagnet for any kind of potential application. And this was even noticed by Louis Néel during his Nobel lecture that he got about his work on antiferromagnetic materials. So really prototypical antiferromagnetic material is iron oxide, hematite. This is the material in which Dziarczycki-Moria interaction was introduced, if you look at the first papers. And now, for example, people also say that this is not only an antiferromagnet, that's also an altermagnet. So that's where you can see that the definition are sometimes a bit difficult to follow. So when we talk about an antiferromagnet, most people will talk not only about the direction of the magnetization of the two sublattices, but about the Néel vector. That is just, let's say, a mathematical tool that is really useful to describe antiferromagnetic state and to describe antiferromagnetic dynamics and also the spin torque that you can exert on the magnetization. So it's just the direction of the magnetization at the end, because you make the difference between the magnetization of the two sublattices. So if we want to be fully honest, antiferromagnetic materials are already used in at least one type of device, which is a GMR redhead. And you use an antiferromagnet in a GMR sensor in order to pin the direction of the magnetization in one of the two ferromagnetic layers. And for that, you use an effect that is called exchange bias. But let's say that there is currently no device that is using antiferromagnets, let's say, as active devices. Active material, it's always more as a passive component in order to pin the direction of the magnetization. So why we don't have any stray field in an antiferromagnet is generally quite easy, just related to the fact that you have negative exchange field. So the spins of the two sublattices, they want to be antiparallel to each other. Then it can become a bit more complicated depending on the type of exchange interaction that you have in your materials. You can have A-type antiferromagnets where the spins in one plane, they are coupled ferromagnetically and they are coupled antiferromagnetically between two planes. Then you can have C-type antiferromagnets where the spins are ferromagnetically coupled along simply a line, but antiferromagnetic coupled in the other direction, and G-type antiferromagnets where the spins are coupled antiferromagnetically in all directions. Let's say that as an experimentalist, I never saw, let's say, a clear signature of this type of differences between A-type, C-type, or G-type antiferromagnet. except maybe when you want to do NV center magnetometry, for example, because in some cases, for like A-type antiferromagnet, you can have uncompensated interfaces, which mean that at the domain wall, you will have a sizable stray field, a gradient of the magnetization, that you can then detect with an NV center, which would be much more difficult to do if you, or impossible to do if you are working with a G-type antiferromagnets. So antiferromagnetic materials, they are quite resilient against extramagnetic field. If you look at the susceptibility and if you compare it with the ferromagnetic case, the paramagnetic case, you will see that the susceptibility is much lower in antiferromagnetic materials below the Néel temperature. And why that? So then what is the effect of a magnetic field on antiferromagnetic state? So if you look at the energy of your system, let's say the simplest case would be when you consider the exchange field, the Zeeman term, and the anisotropy term. And then, in order to simplify the description, it's generally easier just to introduce some exchange field, some anisotropy field, and to compare it then with the field that you apply in your system. And then if you apply a magnetic field, let's say, along the direction of the antiferromagnetic order, what will happen? So you solve your system, you look for the steady state. And what you will see that if the anisotropy field is much lower than the exchange field, you can have what is called a spin-flop transition. When the magnetic field that you apply reach a critical field, that is called the spin-flop transition, that is proportional to the anisotropy field and the exchange field. And so nothing will happen below this critical field, so the spin, they remain really fully antiparallel coupled along the direction of the applied field. And above the spin-flop field, they rotate by 90 degrees, and then they start to tilt. And you would need to apply a field that is as large as the exchange field in order to align the spin fully along the direction of the applied magnetic field. Second situation is the spin-film transition. So where the I think it's the opposite, where the anisotropy field is much larger than the exchange field. And in this case, what will happen at the critical field, that the spins, they will directly go along the direction of the externally applied magnetic field. So let's say that this spin-flop transition is really the most common case. As soon as the exchange field is more than 10 Tesla, this is always what you have. So as soon as the Néel temperature is relatively high, so more than a few Kelvin, this is the situation that you have. This spin-flip transition is more something that you see in synthetic antiferromagnets at the end, which are not real antiferromagnets, and in antiferromagnets with some low Néel temperature. So, as I was also describing in my lecture on magnonics, it's generally easier or simpler to describe a system in a continuum model. And in the case of an antiferromagnet, to describe the system with an L vector, so the difference between M1 and M2, and with a net moment, the dynamical net moment, that is generally equal to 0 by the sum of the magnetization of the two sublattices. Why do we want to describe also the system in a continuum model? It's because if we want to look at spin texture, because we can then introduce, for example, the G-scheme-Moray interaction. And in antiferromagnet, you can have really two different cases. First case, where you have homogeneous DMI. This is a case that will lead to a weak ferromagnetism that you have in most antiferromagnets that are also continued antiferromagnets. And when you have inhomogeneous DMI, in this case, this is when you get some cycloidal order of the antiferromagnetic state. So you really have two different types of DMI in the case of an antiferromagnet. And this is this second term, for example, that will lead to the spin cycloid in the case of bismuth ferrite. And due to the fact that you also have a weak quantity moment, you can detect this cycloid using NV magnetometry. So let's say, more generally, in antiferromagnet, we are always trying to find ways to break the symmetry of the system in order to be able to detect the magnetic properties. So as soon as there is a small quantity moment, it's going to be easier. As soon as the PT symmetry is broken, you will have a new effect, that a transport effect or magneto-optical effect that you can use to detect the properties of an antiferromagnet. So you can have other type of spin texture. So this was observed in synthetic antiferromagnet. That's probably, let's say, the first real observation of antiferromagnetic scammons, but it's just a synthetic antiferromagnetic scammons. And the key advantage of antiferromagnetic scammons are related to the fact that you can compensate the Magnus force that you generally have when a scammon is propagating, which means that the scammons, they cannot go really straight, but they have always what is called a scammon angle. In the case of ferromagnet, it's a bit like the frisbee. When you send your frisbee, is going to go in some direction, and you want to compensate that. You want it to go straight. So in an antiferromagnetic system, it will compensate, and the scammons can go straight. So in pure antiferromagnetic systems, the only type of spin texture that has been observed is this bimeron or antimeron. And when you have two of them, it's kind of equivalent to a scammon, but it's not exactly a scammon. So a pure antiferromagnetic scammons, to my knowledge, was not observed, at least not in thin films. So then the third property, and that is maybe the most interesting one, is the fact that the antiferromagnetic resonance is generally lying in the terahertz range. So if you look at the magnetization dynamics of the antiferromagnetic resonance, you can again describe it by considering the two sublattices, or you can make an equivalence, and then the equation can become a bit more complex, but to solve it analytically and to understand what's going on, it's generally, again, easier to describe it as a function of the Snell vectors in your system. But let's go to simpler cases. So you will have generally two main cases. Either you have an easy axis system, when the spins are aligned along a specific direction, or you have an easy plane antiferromagnet, which means that the spins, they can quite easily rotate within an easy plane, like in bismuth ferrite. So this is why you have this spin cycloid, or nickel oxide, for example. So in an easy axis antiferromagnet, this is a type of antiferromagnetic mode that you have in your system. So at zero applied field, you have two modes that are circularly polarized. One has a left circular polarization, and the other one has a right circular polarization. And we will see a bit later that this is quite important, because when you have circularly polarized mode, you can carry spin angular momentum. So then in order to leave the degeneracy of the two magnon mode, what you can do is to apply some external magnetic field, and you will see that the frequency of the left-handed mode will decrease, and the frequency of the right-handed mode will increase. In the case, so then the gap, so that will determine the frequency of the mode, is determined by the cross product of the exchange field and the anisotropy field. And because of the fact that the exchange field can be extremely large, like 100 of Tesla or even 1,000 Tesla, most of the time the resonance of an antiferromagnet at zero applied field is lying at 100 of gigahertz or up to the terahertz range. So that's why the setup that you need to use in order to detect antiferromagnetic resonance can be quite different from what you do with ferromagnetic material. You cannot use standard microwave tools. For example, a common approach to do it that you cannot do in many labs in the world is to do quasi-optical excitation at 100 of gigahertz with a fixed frequency. The second case that I was describing is easy plane antiferromagnet, where the spins, they can easily rotate within one plane. And in this case, you again have two modes, but at zero applied field, you see that you leave the degeneracy of the magnon mode. This is due to the fact that you have one mode that will correspond to oscillation within the easy plane, so the frequency is much lower. And the second mode corresponds to oscillation out of the plane where you have an hard axis, so that's why the frequency is larger for this out of plane mode. And the specificity is really related to the fact that you have linearly polarized mode, which means that they do not carry any angular momentum. And this is quite important in the context of spintronic, because in spintronic, what we generally try to do is to propagate angular momentum or to use angular momentum in order to manipulate the direction of the magnetization. So a prototypical example of an easy plane antiferromagnet is nickel oxide, where you can see here that when you shine a terahertz pulse on the material, you can detect a narrow band terahertz response at about 1 terahertz that correspond to the antiferromagnetic resonance of nickel oxide for the high frequency mode. And I will come back to this example a little bit later. The last case that I was not discussing until now, it's quite, let's say, a mix of the two previous ones. So it's the case of Cantile antiferromagnets, where you lift also the degeneracy of the magnet mode, but one mode has a circular polarization and one mode is linearly polarized, and this is due to the presence of the DMI field that is present here. So you have a small canting between the two sublattices. And what is interesting to notice is that, for example, for the low frequency mode, the DMI field is not changing the frequency at zero applied field, but just changing the slope of the frequency as a function of field. So which means that generally in ferromagnets, what you say that the resonance frequency increased by 28 gigahertz per Tesla, and it can be much larger in the case of a Cantile antiferromagnet because of the DMI field that is changing the slope of the frequency as a function of field. So there are also a few examples of Cantile antiferromagnets, and you can see that even LSMO, at low temperature, some phases of LSMO correspond to a Cantile antiferromagnetic phase. So then, just one remark on, let's say, the damping and the line width in antiferromagnetic materials. Because when we want to, let's say, make devices, or even just when we want to detect the magnetization dynamics of a magnetic system, generally an important parameter is the quality factor, which is the frequency divided by the line width, which means that the larger is this quality factor, the narrower will be your peak, and the easier it will be to detect it. And this is also an important parameter if you want to make a filter, for example. So in a ferromagnet, the quality factor is really just basically 1 over the line width, 1 over the damping in your materials. So in yttrium and garnet, the damping is extremely small, 10 to the minus 5, so that's why the quality factor can be extremely large. In antiferromagnetic materials, it was observed since the 60s. The quality factor, the best one that people have been observing, is of the order of 100 to 1,000 really in the best cases. And the reason for that is not due to the fact that the damping will be much larger in antiferromagnetic materials. It's really due to the fact that if you just calculate also the line width, you will see that the quality factor, you will see that it's not only 1 over the damping, but there is a prefactor that is the anisotropy divided by the exchange field. And the exchange field in an antiferromagnet is extremely large. So this is why even, for example, in this oxide, yttrium orthoferrite, in which the damping is lower than 10 to the minus 5, the quality factor is still much lower than in the ferromagnetic case. So that's why it's also more difficult to integrate antiferromagnetic materials in any type of microwave devices. So, okay, so we have seen in this short introduction the origin of the different properties of antiferromagnetic materials. So one could say that really 10 years ago, because of those three different properties, it was quite difficult to detect antiferromagnetic states. Generally, people were using some complex imaging technique that you, like second harmonic generation that Jean-Yves was discussing, or synchrotron-based technique, or detecting the properties through proximity effect with a ferromagnet. And in terms of dynamics, there were really few studies either using neutron scattering, some type of Raman scattering, or second harmonic generation, or BLS, but in really specific antiferromagnets. And most of them now we would call them altermagnetic materials, and this was due to these specific properties in this antiferromagnetic system. And it was quite a pity because at the end, if you think about it, the fact that you have terrestrial resonances means that you could be able to develop ultra-fast devices. The fact that you have no stray field means that you could pack much more densely magnetic bit of information without having a detrimental effect of a stray field. And the fact that they are quite robust against external magnetic field means that they are also more protected against external external magnetic field. So the question was really, can you find either intrinsic, hidden knobs or extrinsic knobs that you can use to manipulate the magnetization dynamics in your system? So let's say the extrinsic one, so the most classical one was the exchange bias that I was discussing before. When you put a ferromagnet on top of your antiferromagnet, you go above the blocking temperature, you define the direction of the magnetization in the ferromagnetic material, you cool down, and then the antiferromagnets will align either parallel or anti-parallel to the direction of the ferromagnetic order, so that you can write the antiferromagnetic state by just really defining the direction of the magnetization in a ferromagnet. But let's say it's not that convenient because you need a ferromagnet. Second approach is to apply a large magnetic field. Again, it's not so efficient. So what people thought about is, can we use spin torque as we have been doing in ferromagnetic system in order to manipulate the magnetization dynamics in an antiferromagnet? So the first approach, and it can work, is to put an adjacent layer on top of an antiferromagnetic thin film, either a ferromagnetic one or an heavy metal, in which you put a DC current, and this can exert some spin transfer torque on the magnetization, which means that depending on the direction of the current that you put in your material, you can rotate the antiferromagnetic state by 90 degrees. So if you are interested by this topic, so this was quite popular about 10 years ago. So you can describe it by looking at magnetization dynamics as a function of del vector or as a function of the two sublattices, as I was saying before. Another approach is to use a staggered field. Staggered field, what does it mean? So this was also quite popular nearly 10 years ago. The idea is that you still have a PT symmetric antiferromagnet, but locally you have the two sublattices, they have broken inversion symmetry, which means that they feel, let's say, different environments. There are not so many materials like those one. It's the case of copper manganese arsenic and manganese to gold as the two materials that people have been studying, and I don't have any other in mind that people are currently studying, and in which you can have Néel spin orbit torque due to the fact that the two manganese atoms, for example, here, you can see that they have different environments, which mean that they will feel different magnetic field, opposite magnetic field, when you apply a current directly into the materials. Which means that you can really switch the direction of the antiferromagnetic order just by applying a current directly in a single layers based on this antiferromagnet. So this was done by XMLD PIM imaging, where you can see that they apply a current in one direction. This reverses the direction of the antiferromagnetic order in the middle of the cross. Then if you apply a current at 90 degrees from it, you can kind of recover the initial state, so you are again switching back the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. So here I'm showing some images. You could also do magnetotransport measurement in order to detect the antiferromagnetic state, but I will show you later that the results, they were a bit controversial, or let's say that now they are a bit controversial regarding what was observed at that time. The third approach is probably to use an antiferromagnet with PT broken symmetry that you could also call an altermagnet. The basic idea is that two sublattices are connected by a rotation, but there is no translation or inversion symmetry center. This is what was introduced by Paolo. And this is why people started to introduce, let's say, a third class of altermagnetic material, but let's say that this third class is really strongly connected with antiferromagnetic materials. Because the idea is that the PT symmetry is broken in K-space, except at the gamma points where you are supposed to have perfectly compensated antiferromagnetic order. And the fact that you have PT broken symmetry means that you can have let's say, anomalous Hall effect in presence of spin-orbit coupling or anomalous magneto-optical effect. And so at the end, and this was already quite well known in the past, as soon as you have an antiferromagnet with pretty broken symmetry, you have some specific phenomena that you can try to use in order to detect the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. So I will make then maybe a really short digression in order to maybe discuss some of the differences between altermagnet and continuous antiferromagnet, because many altermagnetic materials, they are also continuous antiferromagnets. So altermagnets in themselves, they can be described just by looking at the magnetic point group, so just at the symmetry of your system. And from that, you expect to have spin splitting of the magnon band or of the electronic band in the middle of the Brillouin zone, but not at the gamma point, as I was saying before. And because of that, you can have also non-zero magnetization in the antiferromagnetic domain hole. So that's why it should also be easier to detect the antiferromagnetic state in an altermagnet, for example, using NV magnetometry. But the thing is that, so this is the description you can have if you just consider non-relativistic phenomena. And in the same magnetic point group, as soon as you switch on relativistic phenomena, like spin-orbit coupling, you can have DMI. So you can also have continued moments, which means that, for example, when you look at the stray field from the spin texture, it is extremely difficult to know if the stray field is coming from the altermagnetic behavior or if it's coming from the fact that DMI is allowed in this type of system. The only difference, and then you need to be extremely careful, is to look at the stray field for different direction of the domain hole, because in one case, the stray field is proportional to the gradient of the null vector, and the other case is just proportional to the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. So as maybe Paolo was saying yesterday, really the most interesting feature of altermagnet is related to this spin polarized electronic band structure, which means that you can have spin polarized current in the system. In the case of an insulator, it's generally really difficult to access the middle of the Brillouin zone, except if you do maybe spin Seebeck measurement. So that would be one way to access a bit the altermagnetic properties. Or, I did not mention it here, but the fact that you have this spin splitting of the magnon band and in presence of spin-orbit coupling is also something that you can use to detect the antiferromagnetic properties using some magneto-optical effect. So let's say that most continued antiferromagnets are weak ferromagnets.
So here on the picture is spin wave, or?
It could, here it's spin wave, but that would be the same if it was electronic band structure. It's coming from this paper, so it was on spin wave, but that would be exactly the same. So yeah, most continued antiferromagnets or weak ferromagnets are really altermagnetic metals. So then, if we look at the band structure, for example, this is the case of hematides. So what you will see that the presence of the DMI field, so will have an impact in the middle of the Brillouin zone. As I was telling you before, the frequency as a function of field is quite different as soon as you have a DMI. So one could say that altermagnetism really, it has an effect only in the middle of the Brillouin zone, while bulk DMI will have an effect really at the center of the Brillouin zone. And spin-orbit coupling can also have an effect in the middle of the Brillouin zone, but generally it's much smaller than the one that you expect from the non-relativistic phenomena. So again, in this case, you can try to disentangle the effect from spin-orbit coupling, so relativistic effect, and non-relativistic effect, but they are generally quite entangled, experimentally at least. So at the end, we have these three main properties, and we can find some extrinsic or hidden intrinsic knob in order to manipulate the direction of the magnetization of antiferromagnet. And based on those ideas, people thought about developing antiferromagnetic memories, or some type of antiferromagnetic transistor, or potentially, and this was not done yet, antiferromagnetic oscillator. So that's why then there have been quite a lot, let's say, of momentum in the field within the last 10 years, since people realized that you could use spintronic phenomena in order to manipulate the magnetization, the magnetic state of an antiferromagnet and the magnetization dynamics. So what I will discuss now a bit more in detail is really what are the different ways to read and to write the antiferromagnetic state. Then I will discuss how we can propagate spin information in antiferromagnets using antiferromagnetic magnons. And finally, I will discuss how we expect in the future, and there are already a few attempts, to detect, generate, and manipulate antiferromagnetic dynamics. So here it's more to read and write antiferromagnetic states, so let's say static states. And in the last part, and it's more challenging, is to what can we do in terms of controlling and manipulating the antiferromagnetic dynamics. So let's move to this first part. So let's say the most conventional way to detect electrically an antiferromagnetic state, as soon as you are working with a metallic or semiconducting antiferromagnet, is to use anisotropic magnetoresistance, because this is an effect that is an even function of the magnetization, which means that even if you have a compensated antiferromagnetic order, you can detect a change of resistance depending on your change of resistance if the current is either parallel to the direction of the antiferromagnetic order or perpendicular to it. So that's really the most classical effect that you can use to detect antiferromagnetic state. The problem is that the amplitude can be relatively small, so only 1%, which is much smaller than what you get in a magnetic tunnel junction, where you have generally more than 100%. Second approach can be tunneling magnetoresistance, in which you put on top of your antiferromagnet a thin insulating barrier. You put a metal on top, and the tunneling probability will be different if the antiferromagnetic order is in parallel or perpendicular to the current. The problem for that, and I'm really not an expert, is that in the calculation, it seems that you need antiferromagnets that are generally based on manganese, and all the results, I mean, most of the results that have been published, they were a bit controversial, and people have difficulties, let's say, to reproduce those results. Third approach is to use the anomalous Hall effect that you have in a PT symmetry broken antiferromagnet, like non-collinear antiferromagnet, and like the altermagnetic materials. And this is an effect that is currently used quite a lot in order to try to look at altermagnetic properties. So manganese 5 silicium 3 is expected to be an altermagnetic materials. And as you can see, it has a really small vanishing moment. You can see maybe a really small opening at zero applied field if you do squid magnetometry. While if you do transport measurement, you can detect a relatively large anomalous Hall effect in this material. So that's really a nice way in order to try to look at altermagnetic properties. So, but this effect here in terms of amplitude is also, remains relatively small, I would say. So what people would like to be able to do is really to have an equivalence, an equivalent system to a magnetic tunnel junction that has been used and introduced in the industry based on ferromagnetic materials. So when you have two layers that are separated, two ferromagnetic layers separated by an insulating layer. So this is something that is really doable with a non-collinear antiferromagnet. There have been a few observations with manganese 3 syn and maybe manganese 3 germanium, if I remember well. And the amplitude of the effect is of a few percent. I think there is even a report that of 30% maybe. So that's one way to do it. So with non-collinear antiferromagnets. The other way to do it will be to use altermagnetic materials. But at the moment, there is no observation. There are probably plenty of groups trying to do that in the world, but nobody has been able to demonstrate anything for the moment. Another nice approach that was done with 2D materials, but it requires to be able to switch from an antiferromagnetic order to a spin flip state where the spin they are fully parallel between each other. And they could measure in this paper so that when they look at the tunneling probability over these 2D antiferromagnetic layers, that they measure really different antiferromagnetic state when they are in the antiferromagnetic state or when they are in the ferromagnetic state above 0.5 Tesla. So with more than 100% of TMR. But it's not a purely antiferromagnetic system, I would say. One way to detect the the magnetic state is to use spinel magnetoresistance effect. This is one way to do it with insulating system that we like to use a lot when we look at spin dynamics. And basically, the idea is the following. So you put an heavy metal on top of your antiferromagnet. And when you inject a charge current, you will have a spin accumulation at the interface due to the spin-orbit coupling, so due to the spinel effect that you have in your materials. And this spin accumulation, when it's parallel to the direction of the antiferromagnetic order, it can be reflected because you can have spin flip scattering event, and it can generate some inverse spinel voltage back to the metal, which means that you have an extra charge current. So you can consider that you have some type of low resistance state. In the opposite case, when the spin accumulation is perpendicular to the direction of the antiferromagnetic order, the spin current can be absorbed, it can exert spin transfer torque on the system, and you don't have this spin current that is reflected back in your system. Which means that in itself, the resistance state is expected to be larger when the spin accumulation is perpendicular to the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. So this is something that has been done quite a lot between 2015 and 2020 in many different antiferromagnetic systems, and this is the type of curve that you could detect. So basically the idea was you apply a field along the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. When you are below the spin flip field, you do not expect any effect, and above the spin flip field, you should rotate the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. And you can see this type of curve. You see that below the spin flip field, not much is happening, and at the transition, you see quite a drastic change of resistance. The problem is that the amplitude of this effect, you can see, so the change of resistance over the resistance is below 1%. So it's nice in order to have a surface-sensitive technique that you can use to detect the magnetic states in really thin films. But in terms of any device implementation, the amplitude of the effect is still relatively small. But the sensitivity that you get is much better than the squid. So if you want to detect tiny, small moments with a squid, with an antiferromagnet, you cannot do it. But with this kind of surface-sensitive technique, you can easily detect the antiferromagnetic state down to a few monolayers. So now let's move to the second thing you want to do in order to make a memory, which is the electrical writing of the antiferromagnetic order. So for that, the first experiments, they were done on copper manganese arsenide, so this antiferromagnet with Néel spin orbit torque, where they were applying the current in this type of all-bar geometry. And so when you apply the current, let's say, horizontally, you expect to rotate the antiferromagnetic order vertically, and then you apply a current at 90 degrees, and you expect to rotate the magnetization. And they were observing this type of sawtooth shape. So they apply some different pulses, and you can see that you reverse the sign of the transverse resistance that you are detecting in your system. People saw exactly the same type of sawtooth behavior when they were looking at insulating antiferromagnet like nickel oxide with an heavy metal layer on top, generally platinum. And they could also, or at least they were claiming that they could switch the direction of the magnetization using spin orbit torque. But what people realized a bit later, a couple of years after, is that in this type of system, you do not have only spin orbit torque. You can have also something that is called thermoelastic switching, because antiferromagnetic materials, they are really magnetostrictive. And when you apply really large current density in a small metallic constriction, you will generate some really large thermal gradients. And that can just compress your lattice, so you can have an expansion. And if your material is magnetostrictive, it can trigger switching of the magnetization. What people also realized is that you can, when you apply such a large an anisotropic thermal gradient, you can induce electromigration. And it was observed in this paper, but only in also in a couple of others, that if you do the same experiment, so you pattern some platinum hole bars on top of a antiferromagnetic film of nickel oxide, or if you do the same on glass, you will observe exactly the same type of sawtooth behavior, which means that at the end, most of the effect that was detected was related to electromigration. Then what people realized nearly at the same time is that maybe there was indeed switching at low current densities, but everything that was detected at high current densities was related to this electromigration. So let's say it was quite difficult to really identify if whether or not there were antiferromagnetic switching in many systems. So that's when people also started to go back quite a lot in synchrotron-based facilities in order to image the switching on the antiferromagnetic state to really confirm the presence of spin orbit torque. And in many systems, especially in insulator, the presence of spin orbit torque is still something that is not fully confirmed in the sense that it's not sure that the efficiency is sufficient to switch the antiferromagnetic state. So I will show you an example of something we did, for example, in nickel oxide. So you pattern this heavy metal stripe on top of nickel oxide. You apply current, and due to the fact that nickel oxide has magneto-optic linear birefringence, you can detect the direction of the antiferromagnetic order just by doing some simple type of Kerr magnetometry. So if you apply a current in some direction, you can see that you completely switch the direction of the antiferromagnetic order in one direction. If you reverse, if you rotate by 90 degrees the direction of the current pulses, you switch back the direction of the antiferromagnetic order. So it was quite a nice observation that you could switch the direction of the antiferromagnetic order, and that the amplitude of the switching was indeed depending on the amplitude of the current that we were putting in the system. But what was realized at the same time, basically, that if you do exactly the same measurement, but you remove the platinum with this circle shape, so you have platinum only in the middle and you have nickel oxide only in the middle, and you still have this type of metallic hole bars. When you apply current in some direction, so the current is flowing only in this part, not in the middle, you can still switch the direction of the antiferromagnetic order in the middle. And if you do the same now, you apply a current vertically, you switch back the direction of the antiferromagnetic order, which means that all this switching process was really related to thermomagnetoelastic phenomena, so which were associated to the thermal gradient that you generate in your system. So I would say that it's still a real challenge to really observe that you can achieve a pure switching by spin orbit torque in antiferromagnetic metals. We can see indication that there is spin orbit torque when we look at the symmetry of the switching, but let's say that the dominating phenomena is really often thermomagnetoelastic effect, at least in magnetic insulator, but also in some metallic system. So there are first attempts of observing ultra-fast spin torque. This was done in the group of Tobias Kampfratz in Berlin, for example, with manganese to gold, where they have been shining some terahertz electric field on a single layer of manganese to gold. And what they can see is a transient response that has opposite sign when they reverse the direction of the electric field. And what they can also observe. So that would be not a full switching, but let's say some magnetization dynamics and some partial switching with the terrace amplitude that they could reach. And what they can see is that if they pre-align the thin film under some really large electromagnetic field, which means that you get a monodomain state, the amplitude of the effect is much larger. And if you use as-grown films in which you have a lot of antiferromagnetic domain, the response is much smaller because the direction of the terrace electric field is not the correct one in order to switch all the antiferromagnetic domains. So also one remark in terms of material growth is that it's generally really difficult to optimize the growth so that you can get monodomain of antiferromagnetic state. One way to do it is to strain the film, maybe to use miscut, as you have seen in some presentation in bismuth ferrite. It's now doable to have, let's say, a single antiferromagnetic state in thin film of bismuth ferrite. But let's say that for bismuth ferrite, it took like maybe 10 years in order to be able to do that. So in many systems, there is a lot of optimization to be done in order really to optimize the antiferromagnetic state in thin films. Another study that was done by the group of Jean-Yves is to try to generate spin torque by ultra-fast demagnetization in an adjacent layer based on a ferromagnet. So here you have bismuth ferrite with cobalt iron boron on top. You shine femtosecond laser pulses on top. You generate ultra-fast demagnetization in the cobalt iron boron. And when you generate ultra-fast demagnetization, you can then inject a spin current in your antiferromagnetic material. And this spin current can act as a spin torque on the local magnetization. And what they could observe is that when they do that, they observe some ultra-fast response in the bismuth ferrite with a characteristic frequency that correspond to the electromagnons of bismuth ferrite, which is an indication that you can trigger ultra-fast magnetization dynamics by spin currents by ultra-fast demagnetization in a ferromagnet. So we are still not at the stage of full switching, but we start to have indications that we can have ultra-fast dynamics that is induced by spin torque excitation in antiferromagnetic system. Yeah.
The magnetization is induced just by heating
Yeah.
the laser?
Yeah, just by heating. Yeah, you generate hot electrons, and so you demagnetize your system. It's really similar to this Bohr repair experiment, for example, that was done in the past. But now you do it on top of the antiferromagnet, and you can see that if you do it, I think maybe it was just done on MgO or Sapphire, you see that the demagnetization is quite different for your ferromagnetic layers when you do it then on top of your antiferromagnetic material, which means that there is really an interaction between the two. So the second part of my talk is how can we then propagate spin information using an antiferromagnetic materials. So for that, as we want to propagate, let's say, uncurrent spin wave or coherent spin wave over long distances, generally we are working with a magnetic insulator. And so in order to inject spin, we need to do it at the interface, either using a ferromagnet, as I was discussing before, or an heavy metal, so that when you inject a current, you have a spin accumulation at the interface, and you can have spin flip scattering events that are generating, propagating magnons in your system. You want insulator to have long lifetime of the spin excitation, and you want to be able, in order to be able to propagate information over long distances, to have some monodomain state, and to have spin polarized magnons. Because in order to propagate spin information, you need to have spin wave mode that carries spin angular momentum. If they are linearly polarized, you do not expect to propagate any information. So I can skip this slide because what we want to use is just a spin wave, and I think maybe I don't remember if I show it in the manual section, but that basically is the concept of a spin wave that you can see there. So in order to look at this type of effect, what people did a lot with ferromagnet, as I was saying, so you inject a charge current in a heavy metal strap, you have this spin accumulation, And when you have spin flip scattering event, you can generate a spin wave because you transfer angular momentum from the heavy metal to the ferromagnet. And then you can detect the propagation of the spin wave with a second metallic transducers in which you will detect the propagating spin wave by inverse spin-Hall effect. But here it's really uncoherent process. You can excite spin wave with any type of frequencies as long as they are thermally activated. So this was done really a lot in ferromagnetic system. And initially, people thought that it may be something really difficult to do in antiferromagnet. And especially because when people have been trying to look at spin wave propagation in antiferromagnet, until 2015, they always observed that the decay length of the spin wave or of the spin transport signal was below 10 nanometer. And people saw that this was due maybe to the fact that the quality factor that I was mentioning before is much lower in an antiferromagnet than in ferromagnet. What was quite surprising that the results, they were really similar for both metallic and insulating antiferromagnet, while we know that the magnetic damping is much better in antiferromagnet. And why was it surprising? Because at the end, what matters in this type of measurement is the magnon decay length. So in a ferro, that is determined by the cross product of the lifetime, that is one over the damping, let's say, and the group velocity. So indeed, the lifetime in ferromagnet can be of the order of up to 2 microseconds, and the group velocity is generally relatively small, 100 of meter per second, up to maybe 3 kilometers per second. Which means that the decay length can be between 1 and 100 micrometer. This is an order of magnitude. In an antiferromagnet, if you look at the lifetime, it is indeed much smaller because of the exchange field. It's of the order of, let's say, 5 nanoseconds, even in the best system. But the group velocity is much larger, which means that the spin waves, they propagate much faster in your antiferromagnetic material. So if you look at the magnon decay length, you do not expect it to be that small. It can still be of the order of tenths of micrometers. The lifetime is small, but it goes so 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, so I'm really slow today. Maybe that's because it's the last day. Yeah, maybe 10. So we'll go fast on this part. So then what we did was to do similar experiment as the one done on ferromagnet. In the case of iron oxide, this can be done in both the quantity plane phase or in the axis phase. And you have circularly polarized magnon mode only in this low temperature phase. So you put an heavy metal strap on top and you try to detect the propagating signal with these two heavy metal detectors. And this is what we could observe. And I will go extremely fast just to show you the proof of concept. So when the antiferromagnetic order is perpendicular to the direction of the spin accumulation, you do not detect any signal. When you reach it, when you reach the spin flap field, and when the null vector is in this case parallel to the spin accumulation, you can inject spin angular momentum in your system, and you can see really an increase of the transmitted signal with a non-zero voltage above the spin flap field, and the maximum at the spin flap field. That won't have time to discuss so much today, but it's related to the fact that at the spin flap field, you decrease the frequency of one mode, you increase the frequency of the second mode, which means that then they have different magnon population, and you start to propagate mainly the low frequency mode that has a lower energy, so it's easier to propagate magnons with this mode. And we could see at that time that the decay length in this antiferromagnetic insulator was above a few microns, up to 10 microns, so much larger than what was observed before. And now we can see that in other antiferromagnetic systems, we also have a large decay length. And one of the issues was the impact of the antiferromagnetic domain, so that show why there is really an importance of trying to optimize the growth process of antiferromagnetic materials. In some thin film where the size of the antiferromagnetic domain was relatively large, we observe quite nice curves that are non-hysteretic. But if you do the same with a multi-domain state, the amplitude is much smaller, and you see this type of hysteretic shape. And if you try then to look at the Magnum decay length, you will see some dip in the transmitted signal at some distances that correspond to the characteristic length of the domain. Then maybe on this part, I will just show you why we can propagate signal in the easy axis antiferromagnet where you have circularly polarized Magnum mode, but also in some cases in easy plane antiferromagnet where the modes are linearly polarized. And this is due to the fact that you can indeed make analogies with optics because you have two linearly polarized Magnum modes. But if you make the sum of two linearly polarized modes, you can effectively generate some kind of circular polarization. The only issue, if you want to make it efficient and that it can propagate over long distances, that those two modes, they need to have basically wavelengths that are not so far from each other, which means that the dephasing length between the two modes should be more or less the same, because if it's not the case, then you do not propagate this circular polarization over really long distances. So this is a process that you expect to be efficient only if the two Magnum branches are quite close in frequency. So the anisotropy should be quite similar within the plane and out of the plane, which was the case in hematite, and this is what we could see. So one way to see it also is to introduce what is called a Magnum pseudo spin, where you can describe your Magnum mode on a Bloch sphere with, let's say, the top pole that will be left circular polarization, the bottom one circular right polarization, and the horizontal axis linear polarization. And then you can consider that your mode is just a projection over this Bloch sphere. And if you are interested, those two papers are quite nice about that. And so that you can see that in an easy plane antiferromagnet, you can also indeed propagate spin information over long distances when you are in a temperature region where those two modes are close to each other. Then I can skip this one, it's not so interesting. You could also do this in continuum antiferromagnet when you have a right circular polarization, like bismuth ferrite. Maybe I had to show one more slide on bismuth ferrite, and they could show that they propagate spin information in the antiferromagnet and that they can control the direction of the propagation, so control the direction of the spin polarization by switching the ferroelectric state in bismuth ferrite. Okay, so in 5 minutes, I go to the to the last part. Just maybe to show you that we now have ways to measure antiferromagnetic dynamics, not only in single crystal, as it was done for really long, and it's still the most common way to look at magnetization dynamics in antiferromagnet. For example, in this continuum antiferromagnet, they shine femtosecond laser pulses on single crystal above the band gap, and so it can generate propagating spin wave, and you can detect by pump probe measurement the propagation of the spin wave at some wave vector that depends on the direction of the pump polarization. But so this effect, I mean, the detection process is based on magneto-optical effects that are quite large only in some specific antiferromagnet like altermagnet. For example, orthoferrite is an altermagnet. This metal is also an altermagnet, so they always use a continuum antiferromagnet that belongs to altermagnet. So you need to have large magneto-optical effect. So it's not so convenient if you want to extend this approach, even though it's quite interesting from a fundamental perspective. And you cannot do this with a thin film because the efficiency of the process is too small. So one way to solve this problem, or to try to solve this problem, is to use spin pumping phenomena. Because then you have a surface sensitive detection, which means that if you excite dynamics in your ferromagnet or in your antiferromagnet, you can generate a spin current that propagates through the interface, and that is converting into a charge current in your antiferromagnet. So this was done a lot with ferromagnet, and it was demonstrated now a couple of years ago that you can do the same with an antiferromagnetic system. And because of the fact that it's a surface sensitive technique, you can expect to do it in a thin films. And so then I will sweep some part just to conclude. I had a few. And what we could show is that in nickel oxide, for example, where people had been able to detect the manipulation dynamics only in single crystal, it was possible to do it in thin films. So where we use a thin film of nickel oxide with a thickness of 10 nanometer, you put platinum on top, you shine femtosecond laser pulses again on these bilayers. By some mechanism that I will not discuss, you can trigger manipulation dynamics. This generates a spin current that propagates back. This spin current can be converted into a charge current that you can detect by electro-optic sampling technique. Again, electro-optic sampling technique, but in this case, you can use a really thin antiferromagnetic layers because of the fact that you use a spin-to-charge conversion in your system. And this is a type of curve that you can detect. So with 10 nanometer of nickel oxide, you see oscillation of the magnetization with a characteristic frequency at 1 terahertz that correspond to the antiferromagnetic resonance of nickel oxide. So I will skip this part. And maybe just to say that, to conclude that the current challenges that have been lasting for some time, it will be to see if we can trigger manipulation dynamics, not only by shining some terahertz pulses or resonant excitation, but maybe also using spin orbit torque so that you inject a charge current in an heavy metal or directly in your antiferromagnet, and you expect to detect oscillation of the magnetization. This is something that is expected above a threshold current density when you fully compensate the damping. This was observed in ferromagnetic materials, where you can see in the case of yttrium and garnet, you can get, when you apply a DC current above a threshold here of 13 milliamp, some auto oscillation, so the emission of a micro-wave signal. And what people are expecting to do is to do the same with an antiferromagnet, but to generate a micro-wave signal not only at 2 or 3 gigahertz, but potentially up to the terahertz range using antiferromagnetic methods. So I will conclude on that.